The hammer from Washington. How a trade earthquake began. Imagine waking up on a quiet August morning, expecting the usual political noise and economic chatter, only to be blindsided by a thunderclap from the White House. Starting August 1st, the United States will impose a 35% tariff on Canadian imports. No warning, no negotiation, just a public letter addressed to Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney and posted straight to social media. Not just a statement, a declaration of economic war. And just like that, the $22 billion tariff war sent shockwaves across North America. Throughout his presidency, Donald Trump had never shied away from confrontation. But this time, the blow was direct, decisive, and aimed squarely at America's closest neighbor. Canada, however, did not flinch. Within 48 hours, Ottawa fired back, and they didn't just match the tariff, they upped the ante. A 50% retaliatory tax on $22 billion worth of U.S. goods. The targets? Not just symbolic products, but strategic ones. Electric vehicle motors, aluminum for beverage cans, pickup truck frames, even something as ordinary as a soda can was now caught in the geopolitical crossfire. And the impact? Immediate, ruthless, relentless. Prices for critical materials exploded. The Midwest Cold Rolled Steel Index, a benchmark for the steel used in auto frames and appliances, spiked to its highest level since mid-2022 within a day. Aluminum followed closely, surging 54% in just a few trading sessions. Analysts warned it could climb even higher if the full weight of the tariffs rippled through the supply chain. American manufacturers reeled. Automakers, already strained by rising labor costs, faced a brutal new reality. Ford, for instance, had just signed a new labor contract that added $850 to each vehicle's production cost. Now, with tariffs driving steel and aluminum up by another 50%, the price of every pickup truck, SUV, and sedan suddenly looked a lot uglier on the balance sheet. A chilling report from J.D. Power predicted that automakers wouldn't be able to pass all these costs on to customers without crushing demand. Their solution? Absorb as much as 70% of the increase. In plain terms, thinner margins, bleeding profits, and an auto sector stuck between a rock and a hard place. And it wasn't just factories feeling the heat. Consumers, already battling inflation, began seeing price hikes on everything from beer to canned soup. Beverage giants like Ball Corporation and Modelo sounded the alarm. Aluminum cans were now luxury packaging. Shoppers were paying the price for a tariff war they never asked for. But amid all the immediate pain, a deeper irony began to emerge, one with far-reaching consequences for America's clean energy future. Because the very tariffs meant to protect U.S. industry were now threatening to undermine one of its most ambitious goals, the electric vehicle revolution. The U.S. had spent years positioning EVs as the centerpiece of its climate strategy. Billions in federal tax credits, infrastructure investments, and manufacturing subsidies, all aimed at dominating the EV race. But those plans were built on complex, cross-border supply chains. Chains that run straight through Canadian mines, factories, and smelters, with tariffs now raising the cost of Canadian EV motors and battery components. American manufacturers found themselves in a bind. In just 3 trading sessions, prices for key EV parts jumped 12%. Battery material costs soared. Samsung SDI, which operates battery plants in Indiana and Michigan, warned that input costs were rising fast, courtesy of the White House's own trade policy. And here's the kicker. That $7.500 EV tax credit. It could be completely wiped out by rising input prices. The one tool meant to make EVs more affordable was now being neutralized by the very policy meant to protect domestic jobs. It's the definition of a self-inflicted wound. A pickup truck rolling off a Texas assembly line now depends on aluminum smelted in Quebec. An EV battery built in Michigan now relies on a copper separator from Ontario. Raise the walls, and you don't just keep others out, you trap yourself in. As the dust began to settle on this opening salvo, one thing was painfully clear. This wasn't just a trade dispute. It was a seismic shift, one that would rattle factories, supply chains, and economies on both sides of the border. Canada strikes back. How the North turned crisis into a green revolution. While Washington doubled down on tariffs, Ottawa went to work, not just with retaliation, but with precision. This wasn't some flailing response. It was a counterstrike laced with strategy, sustainability, and long-term vision, in what some now call the most disciplined economic retaliation in modern Canadian history. Prime Minister Mark Carney didn't just mirror American aggression, he flipped the entire narrative. The first step was clear: symmetrical tariffs. Canada imposed a 50% tax on $22 billion worth of American exports, matching the blow for blow. But that was only the opening act. The second move was unexpected and brilliant. Carney's government introduced a new environmental standard, one that would force every batch of imported steel to come with detailed documentation: origin, production method, carbon emissions per ton. This melt and pour requirement wasn't just bureaucratic red tape. It was a bold statement of green superiority. Because here's the truth: 94% of Canadian steel is made using clean hydropower, not coal. Compare that to U.S. steel, much of which still comes from carbon-heavy blast furnaces. By demanding this data, Canada effectively waved a climate report card in America's face. It was no longer just a trade war, it was a moral war. And Canada had the environmental high ground. Analysts didn't miss the move. Many dubbed it a climate weapon in a trade arsenal. It aligned Canada with a growing global trend. Buyers across Europe, Japan, and even South Korea are starting to favor low-carbon imports. With one policy, Carney positioned Canadian steel as the premium choice for an eco-conscious future. And he wasn't done. In a rapid response to the immediate threat, Carney's administration rolled out $1.5 billion in emergency support for aluminum and steel producers. The goal was simple: keep the mills running, keep the workers employed, and boost capacity, especially in strategic provinces like Quebec. But demand for aid was so high that it nearly maxed out the budget in less than a week. That's how severe the shock was. Smelters warned that if the 50% U.S. tariff stayed in place, cash flow problems could hit hard by winter. But instead of panicking, Canada took it as a cue to accelerate transformation. Take Dofasco, one of the country's largest steelmakers. They're now investing heavily in hydrogen-based direct reduction, a method that strips oxygen from iron ore using hydrogen instead of coal. Combine that with electric arc furnaces powered by Ontario's clean grid, and you've got a steelmaking process that slashes 3 million tons of carbon dioxide per year. Over at Alma Steel, they're shifting to a circular model, aiming to produce up to 70% of their steel using recycled scrap. Greener, cheaper, and future-proof. The vision is clear. Canada doesn't just want to survive the trade war. It wants to emerge from it as the undisputed green steel capital of the world. To ensure domestic demand, Carney added another bold layer to the plan. Every federal infrastructure project in Canada must now use Canadian steel and aluminum. A built-in market, a guaranteed buyer. That's how you shield your industry from international chaos while growing internal resilience. At the same time, Canada closed a dangerous loophole that had haunted past trade disputes. It imposed a third-country quota system, blocking countries like China from routing cheap steel through the U.S. and sneaking it into Canada tariff-free. That move dealt a strategic blow to global arbitrage and forced American suppliers to rethink their export pipelines. Now, U.S. manufacturers faced a hard choice: pay brutal tariffs on Canadian retaliation, or restructure supply chains and pivot to greener Canadian products that aren't subject to new levies. Suddenly, automakers like Ford, Tesla, and GM weren't just battling costs, they were being pulled into a supply-side revolution. It was working. quietly, decisively. But perhaps Carney's sharpest tool wasn't economic. It was diplomatic. Canada launched a formal complaint at the World Trade Organization, accusing the U.S. of unjustified protectionism under the false pretext of national security. Though the WTO's dispute mechanism had been partially disabled, thanks to U.S. refusal to approve new judges, the filing wasn't symbolic. It was tactical, a warning shot, a signal to the world that Canada was playing by the rules, preparing the legal battlefield for broader escalation. And behind closed doors, Ottawa didn't act alone. They shared evidence with Japan and South Korea, two allies also targeted by Trump-era tariffs. If these countries were to file parallel cases, the resulting diplomatic pressure could isolate Washington. Carney called this move pulling the pin on a trade grenade, a vivid metaphor for quiet strength. Meanwhile, as steel prices rose and EV supply chains frayed, Canadian strategy gained traction abroad. The European Union, already planning carbon border taxes, looked north with interest. Japan, eager for low-carbon materials, sent early feelers. What once looked like a retaliatory campaign was morphing into a marketing pitch. Canada, your green alternative to American volatility. And it wasn't just pitch. It was policy. The three-pronged strategy Carney unveiled: symmetrical tariffs, green investment, international legal action, wasn't just about defending Canada. It was about rebranding it from a secondary supplier to a first-choice partner in the coming era of climate-aware manufacturing. While Washington was still reeling from aluminum price spikes and political blowback, Canada was already looking 5 years ahead. Crossroads of the continent. Will America step back or spiral forward? By the time the second week of the tariff war rolled around, the shockwaves had fully reached the factory floors, grocery shelves, and boardrooms across North America. What had begun as a tit-for-tat economic standoff was no longer just about numbers. It was about strategy, survival, and the future of industrial policy on the continent. Automakers were already showing signs of strain. Across Detroit, production forecasts were revised, margins thinned, supply chains snarled. And yet, there was an even more pressing issue looming behind the scenes: the potential collapse of America's clean energy ambitions. The Biden administration had bet big on the electric vehicle revolution. Massive subsidies, tax credits, public investment in EV charging infrastructure, all centered around building a made-in-America green future. But now, thanks to a protectionist tariff barrage, that very vision was on the verge of self-destruction. The $7.500 federal EV tax credit? In theory, it was meant to reduce the cost barrier and accelerate adoption. But if raw material costs, steel, aluminum, battery foils, copper wiring, keep surging, the math no longer works. In fact, as prices balloon, the credit simply gets absorbed by inflation. Its benefit vanishes. EVs risk becoming just as expensive as before, if not more. One estimate put the cost impact at over $30 billion for American consumers in just 1 year. That's not a rounding error. That's a seismic dent in middle-class wallets. Pickup trucks alone were seeing price tags swell by up to $8 each. And remember, this wasn't just about profit margins anymore. These were real-world consequences for everyday people. A family hoping to switch to a hybrid or EV now had to think twice. A beer company planning a summer discount had to cancel. A small manufacturing plant in Ohio was suddenly operating at a loss. And then came the economists. A warning from the Bank of Canada chilled investors. If the trade war escalated and tariffs hit 70%, as some trade experts predicted, it could shave nearly a full percentage point off North America's combined GDP within just 6 months. That's not a slowdown. That's the edge of a recession. What began as a tariff on steel and aluminum was now threatening to cascade into broader sectors: lithium, cobalt, copper, even solar panels and wind turbines. These are the core ingredients of the energy transition. You disrupt them, and you disrupt the future. And yet, Amid this high-stakes gamble, Canada pressed forward with clarity. Mark Carney knew the world was watching, so instead of blinking, he leaned into the moment. His strategy was not to retaliate recklessly, but to recalibrate Canada's entire industrial model around green resilience. While the U.S. appeared locked in a feedback loop of short-term defensive policy, Canada was positioning itself as a long-term solution provider. The narrative had shifted. No longer was Canada just responding. It was leading, through climate-conscious production, trade discipline, and global diplomacy. Steel mills in Quebec were upgrading to hydrogen technology. Federal contracts were locked into using local green materials. International buyers, from Brussels to Seoul, began seriously re-evaluating their sourcing strategies. In just a few weeks, Canada had transformed from a trade victim into a green manufacturing hub with global pull. And what about the U.S.? As inflationary pressure mounted, political pressure did too. Trump, now in the thick of election season, faced a choice with enormous consequences. Pull back from the brink, ease tariffs, return to negotiations, and stabilize prices before the damage deepens. Double down, escalate the trade war further and risk pushing the entire continent into a deeper economic crisis. Inside the Beltway, tempers flared. Some advisors urged strategic retreat, dial down the steel tariffs, renegotiate with Canada, and save the EV sector. Others, steeped in hardline economic nationalism, pushed for further escalation. After all, who blinks first? But geopolitics doesn't wait for second chances. And time was running out. If this trade war continues, it risks rupturing not just commerce, but political alliances, energy policy, and long-term climate commitments. Countries around the world are watching closely. Europe is rolling out carbon border adjustments. Asia is shifting toward sustainability. If North America spirals into a self-imposed industrial freeze, it will miss the biggest economic pivot of the century. The irony is biting. The continent that once dreamed of leading the green revolution may now watch it pass by, led by the very partner it tried to punish. Canada, for its part, is charging ahead. It's investing in hydrogen, scaling up clean aluminum, tying trade policy to environmental metrics, and doing it all with a coherent strategy that weaves economics, climate, and diplomacy into a unified vision. What comes next? That depends on what kind of future the United States wants. One built on cooperation, green growth, and long-term competitiveness, or one mired in reactive protectionism and short-term politics. This tariff war was never just about steel. It's about who gets to write the next chapter of industrial history. And as the world stands at the edge of a climate and technology transformation, North America stands at a fork in the road. Pull back and build together, or dig deeper and fall apart. The stakes? Global. The timeline? Now.